Last Sunday we began a new study we are calling Making Sense of the Sabbath. I know the Sabbath is a sometimes controversial subject among Christians, or else it's a rather ignored subject. And last week we looked at the purpose of the Sabbath, which was to rest, to take a break from the everyday, do something different in order to be restored. We saw how God himself instituted that when he created the world and everything in it. And he established it as a pattern for us to follow. This morning I'd like to continue in that same line, but looking at the penalty of the Sabbath. About 50 years ago, the New York Times published the following in rather graphic terms. State Supreme Court Justice Paul A. Fino, in embarking on a personal crusade against narcotics pushers, is apparently determined to use anti-tank howitzers to kill mosquitoes. In the process, he seems prepared to mow down anyone who considers objectionable this method of judicial overkill, one manifested in a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison imposed on a small-time addict selling a few grains of heroin to an undercover police agent. Judicial overkill was the title on that article, and I'm sure there were some readers that agreed with that. You know, being tough on crime is one thing, but really, 30-year prison sentence for a few grams of heroin seems a bit over the top. I use that as an illustration because that's the way some people would feel when we get into the penalty of the Sabbath. Where it's maybe God is guilty of some judicial overkill. He included the Sabbath in the law for Israel. In fact, he made it a part of the Ten Commandments. But as we're going to see, this is not some suggestion that can be merely ignored if we want to. God established a very severe penalty for breaking the Sabbath. And while it may not be in the same form today as it was then, I think the principle still applies. We begin by considering the immediate consequence of breaking the Sabbath. And we turn to Exodus chapter 31. The passage that was read for us earlier. Exodus 31, beginning in verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes things holy." Right off the bat, God is saying, this is important because it's a sign between us. This isn't just a day off. This isn't just a public health announcement. This isn't just a good idea. This is a sign. And it's a sign of our relationship with each other. It is so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Now remember, God said that he set apart the Sabbath day and made it holy. I believe God is saying here, I created you. I have the right to make the rules. I have the right to set the penalties for breaking those rules. And then he gets into it. Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates the Sabbath is to be put to death. Whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day must be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he abstained from work and rested. Very, very important. The essence that God attaches to the Sabbath. In this passage, he talks about it no less than 5 times. He obviously thought it was very important. This was not something peripheral. This was not something optional for the people of Israel. Now, this is the first passage that spells out the immediate consequence for breaking the Sabbath, and it was death. Verses 14 and 15 clearly state that penalty. Now, there's a phrase in there about being cut off from the people, and scholars can argue, well, maybe that wasn't death, maybe it was excommunication. When it says shall be put to death, that's pretty clear. You don't really need to dig into the Hebrew too much on that one to know what he's getting at. A very severe consequence for breaking the Sabbath. You say, why? Why such a harsh penalty? And again, we're reminded, this Sabbath is a sign between God and the people of Israel. Notice he puts the word in there, the covenant. This is that agreement that God has made with his people. We call this the Old Covenant. This was the covenant with Israel. And the Sabbath was a sign of that covenant. I believe the Sabbath is also a sign of the new covenant. You say, how is that? Because of what it represents. See, the Sabbath is not only an opportunity for us to be refreshed and restored physically and mentally and spiritually. It's also a declaration where we are telling God, I trust that you are going to take care of me. Instead of working to do everything myself, I'm setting this day aside and I'm trusting in you. This is no less a step of faith than the faith by which we are saved. Now, I'm not saying you are saved by keeping the Sabbath. Don't get that wrong. It's a demonstration of the faith. The Israelites were not saved by keeping the Sabbath. They had already been redeemed. They had been redeemed by the blood of the Passover lamb back in Egypt. God has led them out. Now he's saying, this is how I want you to live. And I want you to live by faith. Just as we are to live by faith. And the consequence of that was very severe. Remember, the commandment's purpose was to protect and preserve God's relationship with his people. Breaking the Sabbath was an act of defiant rebellion. It was, in essence, a repudiation of the covenant. It's saying, God, my relationship with you isn't that important to me. You're not worth the time it would take to get to know you. And if you look at it that way, it's not so much that people are being cut off, they're cutting themselves off from God. They're saying, my work, my wants, my way is better than yours. That's the real danger of breaking the Sabbath. Now I want you to notice the context here. In the first half of this chapter, God is choosing 2 men, Bezalel and Aholiab, that were going to be the main workers in constructing the tabernacle, the house of God. We would consider it the church today. And it's in that context that he's saying, you guys too need a break. Just because you're working on the house of God doesn't mean you're exempt from the Sabbath. You too need to take those days off. That's something we need to hear today. Especially those of us, including me, who are in full-time Christian service. It's real tempting to say, oh, but this is God's work. This is so important. I can't take a day off. There's so much to do. You know what that's really saying? God, you can't do this without me. Got that backwards, don't we? But by saying, yes, there's a lot to do, but not today. I have a whole list of things that I could be doing, and they're all good things. They're all kingdom things. They're all God-honoring things. Not today. So even for people working for God, you need this break. It's important to take that time to rest. We can't use our sacred calling as an excuse not to follow God's command. The next time the Sabbath is addressed is just a couple pages over in chapter 35. Beginning in verse 1, Moses assembled the whole Israelite community together and said to them, "These are the things the Lord has commanded you to do. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it must be put to death. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day." Here's the same command, the same penalty mentioned, but he adds something. Verse 3, do not light a fire. What's the significance of that? Well, remember, this is before electricity. This is before natural gas heat. You did everything with a fire. You cooked your food with it. You warmed with it. I mean, it was an essential thing. It was an everyday thing. And I think the lesson here is, even as there's no work of God too important to not rest, there's also nothing so menial that it falls through the cracks. Don't even light a fire on that day. And again, those who disobey are to be put to death. And if to just show that these commands were taken seriously, over in Numbers chapter 15, verse 32, while the Israelites were in the desert, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and he was kept in custody because it was not clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp." So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. Once again, this is not Moses that's expecting this. This isn't the people in a lynch mob action. God told Moses, put this man to death. His idea. And again, we wonder, is this judicial overkill? I mean, seriously, the death penalty for gathering firewood? What goes beyond just the gathering of wood? This was an intentional, deliberate rebellion against the Lord. The verb here that's used in the verse suggests repetitive. It indicates something he was doing more than just one time. It was a recurrent act. He was determined to light a fire on the Sabbath, which goes against the law. He was breaking God's law and doing it intentionally. Now, in the Bible, in fact, earlier in that chapter in Numbers, it talks about unintentional and defiant sins. I think unintentional may give us the wrong word. Because you think, how does somebody sin unintentionally? Well, you might by mistake offend someone and you didn't know it, which could be considered a sin against them. But I don't think that's what the scripture means here. The Hebrew verb that's translated unintentional means to go astray. It can actually refer to deliberate sins of the flesh, which are all quite intentional and which can be forgiven. Yes. But this is something premeditated, planned, carried out. And in some of the Bibles it talks about sinning with the high hand, okay? That doesn't mean much to me. But think of it this way. It's like shaking your fist at God. I don't care what you say. I'm going to do it my way. That's what he's talking about here. And that is cause for a drastic penalty. In fact, in Numbers it says he blasphemed the Lord because he regarded with contempt the word of the Lord. In the New Testament, we're told that blaspheming the Holy Spirit is a sin that can't be forgiven. This is very serious. Again, not just the action that was taken, but the attitude that it displays. We know what God says and we don't care. We're going to do it our way, which is the exact opposite of living by faith. It's doing it our own way. It's a very dangerous practice for Christians to say, oh, I can go ahead and sin because, I'll just ask God to forgive me. 1 John 1:9, we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And we think that that can just get us by. And God says it doesn't work that way. We find that God does not let his children get away with evil, as C.H. Spurgeon would put it. He has ways of getting our attention, and they're usually not very pleasant. So we can see here in these scriptures that this was one of the most important parts of the law to God. He didn't just mention it in the Ten Commandments and forget about it. This is repeated over and over, and it's got a very serious consequence for the individual who breaks it. Now again, you might wonder, why so harsh? And I'm going to admit, this may not be an inspired word, just take it as an opinion. Maybe God was establishing the Sabbath very strictly as a parent might treat a child about bedtime. How many of us, when we were kids, liked bedtime? How many of us liked nap time? No. Nowadays, it sounds like a really good idea, doesn't it? We didn't want to go to bed when we were little. Now we can't wait. Boy, that idea of a mid-afternoon nap, that siesta thing is really not such a bad idea. But when you have a child and you understand the importance of them getting their rest, not only for their well-being, but for yours, you'd be very strict about it. When it's nap time, you nap. When it's bedtime, you go to bed. Because they may not see the importance of it, but you do. Now, hopefully as they get older, they're going to see the importance of it. They're going to be able to establish and make those good choices for themselves. But at the beginning, you've got to start out very strict. Maybe that's what God's doing here. But again, it also points to the importance, not just of taking the day off, but obeying God. It tells us something about our relationship to him. Now, in ancient Israel, the immediate consequence of breaking the Sabbath was to be put to death. And this is certainly not the case today, but I do believe in the indirect consequence of breaking the Sabbath. There were studies done at the University of Arizona that showed the biological need for rest every week and the energizing value of rest. They concluded failure to rest after 6 days of steady work will lead to insomnia or sleepiness, hormonal imbalances, fatigue, irritability, organ stress, and other increasingly serious physical and mental symptoms. In other words, the indirect consequence of breaking the Sabbath is seen in some really serious health issues. We will pay for not taking the break, for not resting. Dr. Archibald Hart is a Christian physician. He has spent his career studying the effects of stress on the human body. He has written a book that I would highly recommend to anybody called Adrenaline and Stress. And in it he writes, the Bible has a lot to say about the Sabbath, the day of rest. What's always fascinated me about the laws governing the Sabbath, about governing Sabbath keeping in the Old Covenant, was that the penalty for breaking the laws was death by stoning. Wasn't that a rather severe penalty for failure to observe a day most of us take for granted today? Not really. The truth is that even today, the penalty for not taking time to slow down and giving our bodies adequate rest is still death. Only it is a slow, self-inflicted death, death caused by too much stress. So here he's saying, no, we may not take somebody out and stone them to death immediately, but they are killing themselves slowly by not getting the proper rest that they need. And these conclusions aren't new. And they haven't always just originated in scientific study. Back in the Gospel of Mark, a passage that was referred to a little earlier, Jesus told his disciples, and in the King James it says, "Come apart and rest." And Vance Havner, who is an old Southern preacher of days gone by, used to say, if we don't come apart and rest, we're just going to come apart. And that's true. If we don't take care of ourselves physically and emotionally and spiritually, there's a price to pay, and it's just a matter of time until it happens. And when it does, it's usually at the worst possible time and in the worst possible place. So there are still consequences for breaking the Sabbath. We need to take those regular times of rest. And again, just like in Exodus 31, those guys working on the tabernacle, even though they were doing God's work, they still needed to rest. They were not immune from the effects of overwork, of overstress. And I'll tell you, this is what preaches to me. And I said it last week, I'll say it again. This series is being preached to me as much as it is anybody here. This is something I struggle with myself. Because there's so much to do. There's always good things to do. And to be able to just say, not today. That's hard. It's a hard thing to do, but it's necessary. Pastors, by and large, and I probably shouldn't use the word large, they're not the physically healthiest among people, all right? Let's face it, there's a whole lot of sitting, there's usually a lot of eating, not a whole lot of exercise, typically. Gives new meaning to the phrase full gospel preacher, right? You know, stress can become a way of life for many in the ministry. Even spiritually speaking, we tend to give more than we take in. And when you give and you give and you give and you give, you eventually give out. And you've got nothing left. This is illustrated in an article that one man wrote called The Tale of Two Oswalds. And he takes two men in the ministry and contrasts them on this very subject. The first, Oswald Chambers. You may have heard that name. He wrote a devotional called My Utmost for His Highest. Very, very deep thinker. Wonderful Christian man. But he died at the age of 43. He was serving in Cairo, Egypt in World War I. As a chaplain. While he was there, he had to have an appendectomy. And after the surgery, he did not give himself time to recover. He just dove right back into his work. And the people that saw him could see his face was sunken in. He lost his color. He just was not healthy. But he would not listen. He died an early death. In contrast, there's another minister named Oswald Sanders. He wrote a number of books, one of them being Spiritual Leadership. He was the director of China Inland Mission back in the day. And he testifies that he almost came to that same end. He says of himself, my life had been stress-filled. He said, I've done stupid things and I've suffered for them. Way back 50 years ago, I was under considerable stress. I began to lose weight. I dropped 56 pounds. And this wasn't Jenny Craig or, Slim Fast. This is unhealthy. My wife would weep when I undressed at night seeing this old bag of bones. He was unhealthy. It was a doctor who told him there's only one thing that'll recuperate nervous exhaustion, and that is rest and sleep. It's the way you build up your reserves again and are able to serve the Lord effectively. That doctor was very wise. He didn't say this is going to be good for you. He said it'll help you serve the Lord more effectively. Make it spiritual and you'll speak to a preacher. And he listened. He began taking that regular day of rest. He lived to be 89 years old. Now, I'm not saying if you take the Sabbath, you're going to live to be an old age and that nobody dies that takes the Sabbath. I'm just saying, you take care of your body will take care of you. You neglect your body and you will pay a price. And just because you're working full-time for the Lord does not make you exempt. It's something we all need. Whatever we may believe theologically about the Sabbath as was instituted in the Old Testament, the benefits to be derived from the strict observance of it are tremendous in terms of physical and mental health. Busyness is not a Christian virtue. Spiritual maturity is not measured by the amount of work we do, no matter how busy we are doing it or how much we get done. I've said it before, there's more to the Christian life than increasing its speed. We need to slow down. Sometimes we just need to stop and take a break. Finally, I want to consider the inclusive consequence of breaking the Sabbath. You see, the Sabbath wasn't only intended for individuals, but for the corporate community, even the land itself. Now, I'm not going to read these scriptures. You can jot them down, or they're in the kids' bulletin. You can look them up on your own, but I just want to mention what they talk about. Leviticus 25. In verses 1 through 7, the Lord establishes a Sabbath year for the land. For 6 years you are to plant your crops, and in the 7th year you're not to plant anything. You let the land rest. Now again you say, whoa, a whole year without planting and without... How are you supposed to survive? And God says, I got that. I'll take care of that. You just trust me and do what I tell you. So you have this Sabbath year for the land every 7 years. And then in the following verses, God establishes a Jubilee year. After 7 periods of 7 years, which makes 49 years, the 50th year was to be a Jubilee. Family property that had been sold was to be returned. And again, the land was not to be planted or harvested. And you think, that's crazy. I mean, how can we survive? How are the farmers going to survive? You can't do that. And God said, you do it in faith. Trust me. It's the right thing to do. But the Israelites failed to obey these commands. And many, many centuries later, Jeremiah said in Jeremiah chapter 17, be careful not to break the Sabbath. And then he concludes, if you do not obey me to keep the Sabbath day by not carrying a load as you come in through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath, I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortresses. Basically, God was saying, if you will not rest, there's going to be consequences for the whole people. And that came about. We know what happened. Babylon came in, they destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, they carried the people off into exile. And in 2 Chronicles 36:20, here's the explanation why that happened. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came into power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. They lost their land because they would not obey the Lord. And that 70 years of captivity was kind of making up for all those Sabbath years that they refused to keep. Later, after the exiles were allowed to return, Nehemiah reminded the people of this truth. In Nehemiah 13:17, I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things And God brought all this calamity upon us in this city. In other words, haven't you learned anything? Your forefathers did this and got wiped out. Now you're doing the same thing. How significant God puts this practice. Not only practically speaking, because it does refresh us. It does have benefits for us physically and mentally. But it's also a sign of faith. Now, in our culture, we have done nothing but increase our speed. Everything is about productivity. Everything is about the bottom line. Oh, if we can get the machines to keep working, if we get people to keep working day after day after day after day, we'll have greater profits. So what? If you work yourself to death, what are you going to enjoy? And I remember growing up, this was true in our family. I found it myself. You may make the most money and be the most miserable because you can't enjoy it. My dad went through it. I've been through it. Sure, your bank account looks great. You don't have any time to do anything with it. And if you're dead, who cares? It's all about following God's design with which He created us. Now, the death penalty is no longer applied to breaking the Sabbath. We don't even have a Sabbath in our culture anymore. But we need to take time. And when we get to the point where it talks about the practice of the Sabbath, you're going to find that it's not always the same day. Those of you that are convinced that Sunday is the Sabbath, well, not for me. This is my busiest work day. But there needs to be a day that you take. And sometimes you got to fight for it. Sometimes you got to fight yourself for it. Because it's that important. No, it may not be an immediate penalty, but it could be an indirect penalty, and the penalty is still death. If you don't take care of yourself, you'll pay the price. Thomas Merton wrote with great wisdom, "To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything is to succumb to violence. Frenzy destroys our inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful." If he didn't write that to pastors, he should have. But the truth applies to us all. Yes, there's plenty to do. There's more than you can accomplish. Let's just face it. We're not called to do it all. Allow room for God to work. Allow room for God to use somebody else, perish the thought, to accomplish what you think you've got to do. Because if we don't, we're going to find that the penalty of the Sabbath is very severe.